Good morning, everyone. That is quite a session to follow up, so me and my panelists here will do our best to keep this positive momentum going. Our next session is entitled Progress and Next Steps in Working Towards Welcoming Communities. Before we start the session, I want to give a thanks to our sponsor, the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, who's sponsoring today's session. I want to cut to a quick video from our sponsors.
Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, CCIS, is mandated by community in the past 35 years to facilitate the settlement and integration of immigrant and refugee in Calgary and Southern Alberta. In order for us to build capacity to successfully facilitate thousands of immigrant refugees in our community in Calgary and Southern Alberta, we know that we have to recruit and maintain high-quality volunteers and staff. Our job at Calgary Catholic Immigration Society in partnership with community is to make the settlement integration in Calgary and Southern Alberta a success. Success for newcomers and success for the host community. We want them to make sure that they feel that people in this community, they want them to succeed. They are going to be their new friends, their new mentor, and they would do everything possible to make the initial and ongoing settlement integration experience for them as pleasant as possible. We know immigrants and refugees, they pay a big price to come to Canada with huge hope and dream of becoming part of this great country. As a community, we do everything possible, and Calgary Catholic Immigration Society, representing the community, provides support services to make sure immigration and settlement and integration for newcomers is a successful process. The ultimate success is when people settle, integrate, and call Canada proudly their home.
Thank you again to CCIS for being a sponsor for P2P and for this session. Today we'll explore what makes a welcoming community, how to measure those characteristics, and how those communities can be promoted across the country. We'll be able to explore these ideas holistically from the research point of view, from a policymaker point of view, how it affects small centers, how it affects the Francophone community, and from the practitioner lens as well. I am joined today by my four esteemed panelists. First, we have Leah Hamilton. Leah is a professor for the Department of General Management and Human Resources, cross-appointed with the Department of Psychology at Mount Royal University in Calgary. We have David Kashabak. David Kashabak is the Director General of Settlement and Integration Policy at IRCC. Victoria Estes, who you know, is a professor at the Department of Psychology, a director for the Network for Economic and Social Trends, and the principal investigator for P2P. And last but not least, we have Hector Vera. Hector, c'est le directeur de politique à Fédération des communautés francophones et acadiennes de Canada, FCFA. Welcome to all of you. And Leah, I will turn it to you. Thanks.
I'm thrilled to be part of this plenary on welcoming communities. Today I'm going to be talking about some work Vicki and I are doing on measuring and promoting welcoming communities. Back in 2010, when we prepared the original report on characteristics of a welcoming community, I was actually a graduate student at Western. I actually remember my partner proposed to me one Friday night, and we finished dinner, and I was like, well, yes, and I gotta go. Like, I have this big deadline because this welcoming communities report is due. Yeah. It was a realistic preview of what life was going to be like. But anyway, it's pretty neat to be here today as a professor while two new graduate students are working on this project, Awish and Priscilla. So what do we mean when we talk about welcoming communities? What a big question. When we look at the literature, and of course there's lots of contradictions, a welcoming community has a spatial dimension, so it's a physical location. Our keynote, Nora, talked a lot about the importance of physical touchstones, like physical places are how we feed people, how we gather. And it also has a discourse dimension. So a community has agency and engages in actions that facilitate the integration of newcomers. We know that a welcoming community attracts and retains newcomers by identifying and removing barriers, promoting a sense of belonging, meeting diverse needs, and offering services and supports that promote successful economic, social, cultural, and political integration. So why is work on welcoming communities important at this time? As we heard Minister Fraser say in his talk, the new levels plan mean that over 430,000 new immigrants are expected to arrive in Canada each year, and Canada is really depending on immigration to facilitate post-COVID-19 recovery. Also maintaining the vitality of smaller Canadian communities and of Francophone minority communities often depends on immigrants. As many of you know, there's a continuing emphasis on outcome measurement, including at the community level. So this is to ensure that the work we're doing to promote welcoming communities and to support the settlement and integration of newcomers is having an impact. And outcome measurement is also an important component of IRCC's core principles that underpin all programming funded under the settlement program. So as I mentioned, back in 2010, Vicki and I and a team of individuals wrote the original report on characteristics of welcoming community, and I know that some of you have used or continue to use that report. It's been widely used since 2010, and it's well cited, but it's kind of dated now, and we sort of thought, well, it's been 12 years, like one or two tiny things have changed, so maybe it's time for a refresh. Maybe we can do even more with this, so we were really excited about that. So based on feedback from colleagues who have used or are using this report, what we have in mind is two more practical toolkits. So one on measuring welcoming communities, that's what I'm going to be talking about today, and the second on promoting welcoming communities. And we want to ensure that we really maintain the evidence-based rigor that existed in the original report. And then we're going to be doing some workshops to provide hands-on training for how to use these toolkits. So today, as I said, we're focusing on the first toolkit, the Measuring Welcoming Communities toolkit. And this includes the characteristics of a welcoming community, and then what are the indicators for each of those characteristics. So for this toolkit, the first question we asked ourselves was, what characteristics make a community welcoming? What a big and tough question. We turned to our old report, we turned to the literature, what we see in practice, what we've heard from all of you, consultations with stakeholders, and in the report, although we try to discuss each characteristic individually, we know that these don't operate in isolation. You can't disentangle employment opportunities from social connections or access to great programs from immigrant serving agencies. We know that these characteristics are mutually reinforcing. They build upon or they reduce the impact of each one alone. So we can't completely decouple these characteristics. And we also know that the importance of each characteristic to a given community will vary. And that also includes the conversation about these characteristics. So what suitable and affordable housing looks like in one community is going to be really different from another. Also, each characteristic must take into account the needs of multi-barriered groups, such as racialized women, youth, refugees, people from the LGBTQ2S+ community, and so on. So in 2010, we had 17 characteristics of a welcoming community. And now we have, tentatively, we have 19. Some are revisions from the 2010 report, including a couple that have been merged, and some are brand new. So the big additions or revisions are listed in green on these slides. I hope you can see that. So I'll quickly go through these now. So access to affordable, adequate, and suitable housing, employment and entrepreneurship opportunities, access to suitable health care, including mental health care. And I just want to note that we are emphasizing the mental health care piece in this version. Access to immigrant serving agencies that meet immigrants' needs, positive attitudes toward immigrants and racial, cultural, and religious diversity, access to transportation, educational opportunities, access to services and supports for French-speaking immigrants by French speakers, that's new, immigrant-friendly municipal features and services, ongoing commitment to anti-racism and anti-oppression. Our youth plenary panel spoke to this really beautifully. Coordination and collaboration among community organization and different levels of government working toward welcoming communities, equitable neighborhoods, which is new. Opportunities to form and join social and community networks. Again, we heard our keynote talk a lot about that. Positive Indigenous immigrant relations and understanding. That's new and really important. Immigrant-friendly police and justice system. Access to diverse religious and ethnocultural organizations. Civic and political participation opportunities. Access to inclusive public spaces and recreation facilities. And equitable media coverage, representation, and content. So this next piece is tricky. We'd like to come up with a ranking of the characteristics, even though, as I said earlier, we really understand that the importance of each characteristic to any given community will vary somewhat depending on context, timing, and so on. So while those 19 are fresh in your mind, if you don't mind completing a quick ranking exercise for us, there's QR codes on the table there on the 8.5 by 11 handout. There's also little short URLs, if that's easy for you. But basically what we're asking you to do in that little survey is just drag and drop. So the 19 characteristics are listed, and you can just drag and slide and move them around and put them in whatever order you think, putting the most important one at the top and the least important one at the bottom, again, with all those sort of caveats in mind. Okay, I'm going to keep going. If you didn't finish, you can do it later. Whoever gets this right will get a prize. No, I'm just kidding. There is no right. There is no right. Okay, so now I want to talk about the outcome indicators for each characteristic. So one of the things we've talked a lot about is how essential it is to examine multiple indicators for each characteristic. So some of these will be measured objectively, others are more subjective or based on people's perceptions or lived experiences, but both are really important. It's also important to note that meaningful comparisons are necessary. So indicators are not going to be super useful. Indicators for immigrants are not going to be super useful without knowing the levels of these indicators for other groups or other contexts. For example, how do immigrants compare to non-immigrants in a community? How do current immigrants in a community compare to previous cohorts of immigrants? How do different groups of immigrants or refugees in a community fare? So looking at average levels on an indicator, for example, might hide the fact that certain groups are not doing well in that community. Also, comparisons to other communities are going to be really important. And finally, it's useful to know whether the initiatives we've launched to make a community more welcoming are having an impact, so sort of a pre-post comparison if that's possible. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like, keeping in mind, of course, we're going to have fairly extensive lists for each of the 19 characteristics. I've listed the indicators for access to affordable, adequate, and suitable housing, and I'll go through these really quickly. So housing affordability, availability of subsidized nonprofit and co-op housing, whether the available housing is of adequate quality, evidence of overcrowded housing, rate of core housing need, rate of supply and vacancy of suitable housing, evidence of housing stability, rate of home ownership, rate of unsheltered homelessness and unhoused, rate of hidden homelessness, evidence of discrimination in acquiring and living in housing, availability of reliable information in both official languages and other top languages of new arrivals about housing markets and tenants' rights and responsibilities, level of knowledge about the housing market and how to obtain housing, level of knowledge of rights and responsibilities as tenants and homeowners, and then level of satisfaction with information for immigrants about housing in Canada and tenants' rights and responsibilities, and level of satisfaction about current housing. So as you could see, the first two slides had more of those objective indicators, and this slide shows the ones that are perceptions are a little more subjective, but also really important. So now you may be thinking, well, wow, like there's a lot of indicators for each characteristic. And there are. And we're certainly not suggesting that all of these indicators need to be measured each time a community wants to look at the level of a certain characteristic in that community. But by having these extensive lists, researchers, communities, agencies can select which indicators they would like to measure at a specific point in time based on their own priorities and perhaps what's feasible for them and what makes the most sense in their context at that moment in time. So it gives people options. So they might choose to measure a couple objective indicators and one or two subjective indicators as well. I hope that makes sense. So as for next steps for this project, we're going to conduct further consultations with immigrants. We will complete and disseminate the measurement toolkit fairly quickly here. And then we're going to provide workshops on the use of the measurement toolkit. So please come to those. They will be advertised through the P2P listserv. These may include strategies for actually figuring out which characteristics are most important for specific communities, even checklists for determining which indicators to use for a community, sources of data, etc. After that, we'll develop and promote the Promoting Welcoming Communities Toolkit. This will include structures and processes that lead to each characteristics. By this, we mean what sort of produces, sustains, or impacts those outcome indicators. So for instance, the presence of bridging programs would impact employment opportunities. This Promoting Welcoming Communities Toolkit will also include promising practices. So many of those will come from the evidence-based promising practices library that P2P has been developing over the years. That's on the P2P website. So we would love to hear your feedback on this phase of the project, either in the question period later or through our, you feel free to email us. I've provided our contact info here. Thank you so much, and thanks for taking the time to do the rating exercise.
Thank you very much, Leah. David, I'll go to you next. David will be speaking on the changing immigration landscape and community resilience and focusing on post-pandemic ones.
Thank you so much. All right, good morning. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. It's a pleasure to be, it's actually very stressful to be in front of a room full of people instead of a room, I will completely admit, but it's nice to be returning to an in-person forum and for joining this panel. Thanks for the invitation, Vicky and Sarosh. And as you've just said, I'm going to speak, a bit this morning to look at a bit of the changing immigration landscape, how our settlement landscape has been changed by the pandemic, but also start to look at a bit of the lessons that we learned and how that helps inform our way forward. So let me start with a bit of the COVID-19 legacy. What have we learned? And I think I think this was part of what I said at P2P last year, so I won't repeat what I said at that point. Instead of going there, thought a bit of an opportunity to reflect on the lessons that we continue to learn and to take from that experience. And the first really, I think, important one is to recognize that the crisis brought a heightened obligation to manage and to keep managing our responses to the needs of newcomers. The most basic needs were precariously difficult to meet, such as keeping our clients healthy and safe, of course, but also ensuring our ability to keep providing the necessary supports and respond to the economic disruptions that were caused, and I think in some cases continue to be caused by an unpredictable public health environment. So not only was our and your regular business suddenly harder to do, but we really needed to do more than before to ensure the well-being of newcomers. And I think if there's any lesson that we take from the last couple of years is that I think, collectively but the settlement sector in particular, rose to that challenge. And I think looking back, we see that our ability to continue to support newcomers during that period was the result of a number of collaborative actions taken by levels of government, many, and by Canada's settlement sector. And I think one of the lessons, and this is a bit of a second takeaway, is our ability to welcome newcomers is critically dependent on our ongoing and dynamic collaboration. And if you'll allow me to quote Jean from yesterday's panel, working together works. I jotted it down on a Post-it. It was tremendous. So from the critical pivot, I think we saw from, I think service delivery that had been primarily in person to one that by necessity had to go online, or it provided an alternative mode, to the on-the-ground health supports. We saw funder and service providers adjust to meet the diverse needs of newcomers. Again, here, how we learned the importance of being able to adjust in real time to support our clients. The pandemic and our experience through it reminded us that we always need to be ready to react to sudden developments to ensure not just the health and safety of our clients, but their success. And local responses helped ensure that public health guidance and service delivery could be adapted to meet the needs of those, for instance, who face different barriers, low language proficiency, digital literacy challenges. So another important takeaway here is to never forget the value of the on-the-ground role that service providing organizations play in identifying and meeting those needs. In all of these ways, and I'm about to pivot to the present day, but in all of these ways, the pandemic clearly highlighted a lot of the importance, of the relationships and the settlement programming infrastructure that we've built over the years. And I think that's something that we've been hearing throughout the last couple of days of the conference. So where are we now, looking at some of the challenges and opportunities of that shifting immigration context? I'm just going to switch over to French a bit. Donc, comme nous regardons vers l'avenir, nous travaillons sur ces questions alors que le paysage continue d'évoluer et présente de nouveaux défis et opportunités. Récemment, le gouvernement a annoncé que le Canada compte accueillir dès l'année prochaine 465 000 immigrants, 485 000 immigrants en 2024 et vers un demi-million de nouveaux résidents permanents supplémentaires en 2025. Donc, en plus de cette croissance ambitieuse et continue de nos cibles d'immigration, la composition des nouveaux arrivants continue de changer. Et avec cette évolution, on voit aussi la croissance des voies d'accès à la résidence permanente et l'accent qui est mis davantage sur la sélection en partie des immigrants économiques, mais aussi l'immigration qui est basée sur le lieu et sur l'immigration francophone. Et bien sûr, l'arrivée de la cohorte ukrainienne fait partie des mouvements de population récents dont les besoins ont dû être satisfaits par le secteur de l'établissement. Et n'oublions pas non plus l'obligation ou l'engagement que le Canada a pris envers la réinstallation de 40 000 réfugiés afghans. Nous savons donc que de plus en plus de clients nous arrivent avec des besoins qui sont complexes, voire plus ou très complexes, qui nécessitent aussi des approches qui deviennent beaucoup plus personnalisées, qui demandent notre compétence à tous, mais aussi du temps et d'expertise. So in addition to that shifting immigration landscape, we're working, I think, within the context of some broader societal changes as well. And I think the last 2 years have helped reveal how important it is, and ever so important, to continue to incorporate an anti-racist and intersectoral lens in all of the work that we do as policymakers, but definitely in how we deliver these programs and services. We know that each newcomer has unique identities and social contexts. We need to consider how these should inform our programming priorities, but also how we engage with our clients. Within the program and in collaboration with the settlement sector, I think we're taking a number of steps now and continue to help identify potential areas for programming improvements. For example, having recently launched a targeted request for quotations under the broad theme of equity, we're really looking here to help service providers respond to systemic racial or gender inequalities in settlement. And projects, and I think we're all looking forward to seeing what comes from this process, but trying to build and looking to build support for organizations to promote anti-racism, support for organizations that are led by Black, Indigenous peoples or peoples of color, and build that capacity within parts of the sector, and also research to make sure that we're able to better serve racialized newcomers. Donc, vers où? So that, now I'll sort of switch a bit toward, where we see ourselves going. Donc, vers où allons-nous? Avec les pénuries de main-d'œuvre qualifiée, l'inflation élevée et les prévisions que nous faisons peut-être face de plus en plus à une récession, nous savons que l'accueil des immigrants fait partie et devra faire partie de la solution. Et ceci met l'accent sur le besoin d'un établissement, une intégration réussie, encore plus que jamais. Nous savons que la programmation axée sur les résultats est essentielle à cet égard. Nous savons aussi que la compréhension des résultats nécessite une approche à plusieurs niveaux, puisque chaque nouvel arrivant commence son parcours d'établissement avec un ensemble d'atouts et de compétences différents et fera face à des obstacles différents lors de son parcours. Nous savons également que la connaissance et l'accès aux services, les types de services fournis et la manière dont ils sont accessibles sont d'autant d'éléments qui ont un impact sur la réussite de l'intégration de nouveaux arrivants. Les nouveaux arrivants aussi, c'est un défi, je pense, auquel on continue de faire face. Ceux et celles qui nous arrivent pour travailler dans les professions réglementées font face à des obstacles dans la reconnaissance de leurs titres et de leurs compétences étrangères. Nous savons également que les demandeurs principaux, par exemple de la catégorie économique, ont tendance à atteindre le revenu moyen canadien en moins de 5 ans après leur arrivée, tandis qu'on tarde. C'est encore un défi pour voir les réfugiés ou les immigrants de la catégorie du regroupement familial qui ont besoin de plus de temps pour rattraper ce revenu moyen-là. So as we prepare to respond to some of these challenges and these conditions and successfully continue to do our work in integrating record numbers of newcomers to Canada, we know that geography matters. I'm back into the community, I think, topic. While employment opportunities will often draw newcomers to a particular community, the likelihood of them staying there is really a function of a lot more indicators and conditions of success. We've seen, I think, the impact that local immigration partnerships and les réseaux d'immigration francophones have had in our communities across the country. And looking at the 86 LIPs, for instance, we know how important their role has been in terms of helping coordinate services for, right now, Ukrainians who are arriving in Canada, but also in facilitating connections that may not have otherwise happened. And this is back, back, not to go back to the past, but I think something that through the pandemic, LIPS we saw increased, and our community partners, right, increased awareness of public health measures and vaccine awareness with newcomers, advocating with public health authorities around this population as one that needed to make sure that we served. Many local immigration partnerships have also facilitated the extension of community partnership networks beyond the traditional settlement partners. For instance, we're seeing, I think, a lot of new initiatives to bring together refugee youth with Indigenous youth into joint summer camps and really trying to make that a real connection. In addition, we continue to, I think, learn the lessons and kind of push our reflection, based on what we've seen with the Atlantic immigration pilot, but also the lived experience with the rural and northern immigration pilot, really to try to increase and see where we increase. What are the roles of other partners, employers, local communities, in attracting, but also really getting into that secret and that magic ingredient in terms of the retention in places where we know we need newcomers and there's probably opportunities and other supports available. I think that's one, from a policy perspective anyways, it is definitely where we see a lot of what we would have traditionally seen as a selection in the immigration world, and not, and really trying to bolt the design of some of these things, bolt on that issue of what would make a welcoming community. How do we make sure that this is kind of baked in to the selection program to sort of give a leg up? I think if we come back to a bit of the lessons that we keep learning on the implications for of our forced maybe a pivot to digital or hybrid service provision over the last years, I think the evidence that we're seeing to date is encouraging. In a lot of the annual performance reports that we receive from funded organizations, so we do read them. They're very important sources of information because I'm about to quote them. What we're seeing through those reports is that moving to digital hybrid provision has allowed agencies and organizations to serve a larger number of clients, maybe sometimes covering a wider area and serving more clients at the same time. We're seeing then from the perspective of the client a bit of the same thing as we do analysis of our newcomer outcome survey and looking at the benefits sometimes for women and vulnerable populations for whom transportation and childcare remain, despite our best efforts, barriers to access. And that online delivery of service allowed for faster information sharing and enabled for easier referrals in some cases. What we're seeing I mentioned the newcomer outcome survey, newcomer respondents revealing self-reported sense of belonging, or agreeing that their communities are welcoming, these metrics are staying as high as pre-pandemic. So, an evidence source and a data point for us. That said, we know, and I'm not here to say that online service delivery is a panacea. I think one of the challenges that we have ahead of us will be how to optimize the benefits of online or hybrid or digital service delivery by considering which services and which clients may be and will be best served by these methods and these technologies, while continuing to refine in-person service delivery to respond to their client needs. So as I come to the end of my remarks, looking at a bit of some of the questions that we continue to work on and work through. And really the main one is, how does the settlement program position itself to respond to these challenges, to, I think, capitalize on the opportunities and build on this shifting immigration landscape. And I think a lot of the space we have will be the next funding cycle, and CFP 2024 becomes a place where some of these reflections will sort of come to fruition. So as we reflect on that process, we're focused on evolving and making sure that we're keeping pace and equipping our partners in delivery and in the settlement sector with the ability to keep offering services to respond to the needs of clients. And to do so, the lens, we're going through 3 questions to help guide that reflections. Are we delivering the right services? Are we reaching the right clients? And are we serving the clients at the right time in their immigration journey? So I think the CFP and the prep toward it, the process that as we get there, will be an opportunity for us to consider what design changes, what strengthened or different capacities will help contribute to our ability to continue to deliver with that evolving context, work toward national consistency where that makes sense, while also responding to local needs and priorities. So we will be looking to you, among many other players and partners, but looking to you in this room to see how we, and the lessons that we learn and what we see in delivery and in the field and in those local communities, to see what works, what may not work as well, and where we have opportunities to look at optimizing not only benefits in the mode of delivery, but also how to build communities and place-based approaches, including to support Francophone immigration and Francophone settlement outside of Quebec toward those ends. So I think I will leave it at that. 20 seconds. I think, remarkable response of the Canada settlement sector through the last couple of years, and I think we're super well positioned as we continue the reflection over the next few. Thanks very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, David. I think David took my, we're starting a little bit behind schedule to heart, so thanks for that. Next, I'll pass it to Victoria Estes. Victoria will focus on the impacts in the smaller centers and rural centers.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about attitudes toward immigrants in smaller Canadian communities, which are a really important component of welcoming communities. And although I'm the one who's giving this presentation, there were 8 of us who actually put together the survey on which this research is based and are now working on these analyses. So just starting with the context, we do a lot of public opinion surveys, right? You see them all the time. But they often rely on national samples. For example, the Environics 2022 sample. And these national samples, by definition, often mainly represent larger cities just because they have more population. So we don't have that much knowledge on attitudes toward immigrants and immigration in smaller communities in Canada. And yet, regionalization programs are aiming to promote immigration to these smaller communities, like the Atlantic Immigration Program and the Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot. And yesterday, the minister talked about how important these regionalization programs are in the New Levels plan. And positive attitudes toward immigrants and towards immigration are a crucial component or determinant of the success of these programs. So we launched a survey, and the survey was initially developed in 2020. Actually, before 2020, it was ready to launch, and then the pandemic happened. So we decided to delay it until 2022, this past summer. What we were looking at was attitudes toward immigration in smaller communities and how people feel about immigrants coming to their own communities, and also some of the bases of these attitudes. So the survey was conducted in 11 communities across the country. These communities were selected by an even larger P2P team that included government representatives, researchers, service providers, and others, helping us to decide what communities to select, and it was a hard job. What we decided was that we would take communities that differed in a variety of ways, so some that were a bit smaller, like Bathurst, some a bit larger, like St. John's. What's the percentage of immigrants in these communities? These are the latest 2021 data that just came out. How recent these newcomers are, whether the community has a lip or not, whether the community is predominantly English or French or has a mix of both, so that we'd have a lot of variability. And that variability may help us understand attitudes, and it would also help us to have some idea across communities what the picture is, really. I should say that the samples were approximately 400 people in each community, and we were targeting age and gender, which means that this is a relatively representative sample. That's really important. If you just pull people in, your friends, or you do snowballing techniques, you don't get a representative sample necessarily, and the people you're interviewing or you're surveying don't necessarily represent the community. So we actually recruited people through random digit dialing for the most part, and then if they agreed to be in the study, they were directed to the online survey. So what did we find? One of the questions we asked people in these communities is where are they getting information on immigrants and immigration to Canada? And what you can see here is that the top sources of information in most of the communities is television news programs, with direct contact with immigrants also mentioned quite frequently. So television news, which I personally don't ever watch, but anyway, that's considered a prime source of information in these communities. And you can see here that people also talked about traditional print news, social media, and family and friends as sources of information for them about immigrants and immigration. So what were the attitudes of people in these communities? So first of all, we looked at attitudes, their attitudes toward immigrants and immigration to Canada. And this is a question that's often asked in national surveys. So in your opinion, do you feel there are too many, too few, or about the right number of immigrants coming to Canada? And this figure shows the percentage who said too many. And you can see that in communities such as Wood Buffalo, Greater Sudbury, St. Hyacinth, more than 30% are saying that there are too many immigrants coming to Canada. And in other communities, the percentages are hovering around 25 to 30%. So given this finding, you may wonder what type of people or what class of immigrants people are most welcoming of or want to come and live in Canada. And so this question asks people, for each group, indicate whether you think we should allow none, a few, some, or many to come and live here. And what you can see here is that economic immigrants, of course, are prioritized, but in this, across communities, refugees are also viewed very favorably. This isn't always the case in the national surveys. Usually economic comes up as the number one, but in these communities, very favorable to bringing in a lot of refugees. So that's sort of a positive story, but we also asked about preferences among refugee groups. And this is people's attitudes toward Ukrainian versus Afghan refugees. You may not be surprised, we've talked about this yesterday, how some refugees are prioritized over others. This is public attitudes. This isn't about whether we're providing services to these groups, but this is public attitudes toward Ukrainian versus Afghan refugees. Okay, so these are people's perceptions of immigrants coming to Canada. But what about immigrants coming to your own community? So we also had a set of questions about that. And we asked people, do you agree or disagree that immigration to, and then their community name was put in there, should be encouraged? And you can see that there's quite a bit of agreement, actually, that immigration to their own community should be encouraged, with some variability among the communities. So pretty favorable about immigration being encouraged, but we also asked people what the impact of immigrants are on their community. So do you think immigrants in, and then their community came up, are having a positive or negative impact on your community? And what you can see here is that the vast majority of people actually said immigrants are having a positive impact, with this a bit less likely in some communities like Greater Sudbury, for example. And people who responded positively were asked, in what way is it positive? Okay, this was an open-ended question, so these are the themes that people expressed spontaneously. They mentioned multiculturalism, filling labor shortages, a positive impact on the economy. These are direct quotes of what people said. So as a relatively insulated community, introducing multiculturalism provides more information and understanding of the whole world. It's great, etc. And here are a few other positive themes that came up. I see many smart and hardworking people who want to give back to the community. They are going to higher education to be doctors and social workers to generally give back to Canada. They also mentioned diversity in arts and culture, and I think this is important because it does tell us the type of messages that we can use to promote positive attitudes. Okay, what about the negative? And you can see that, the percentage of people who said that immigrants were having a negative impact on the community was low, but still up to, say, 13% in Sudbury, 12% in Wood Buffalo. And people who said that immigrants are having a negative impact were asked, in what way is it negative? And this is the stuff that they said spontaneously. So first of all, it's having a negative impact on the labor market. They're taking away jobs from people who have been born and raised here and can't find a job because there are so few available. They talk about failure to adopt and respect the Canadian lifestyle, weakening of Canadian and Christian values. They talk about immigrants contributing to the housing crisis. There seems to be an influx of immigration here for the past few years, and we are having a housing crisis, plus our economy is bad. And then a non sequitur, they rent and wreck the places they're in, and there's serious garbage issues. They talk about something, we know is one of the negative comments, that immigrants or refugees are getting government benefits, maybe even more than Canadian-borns is the claim. And then this issue of increase in crime. I should mention, whenever they mentioned increase in crime, they often mentioned specific groups, which we didn't put here because we thought it was pretty offensive. But often very specific groups are targeted for this increase in crime, usually drug-related or guns in particular. So one of the questions we asked was whether people in your community, whatever your community is, are welcoming of immigrants. And you can see here that, there is some variation and across these communities with places like, say, Thunder Bay, Prince Albert, thinking their communities are less welcoming. But we also asked, is your community welcoming of immigrants who are not white? And consistently, we find that people are saying the communities are less welcoming of people who aren't white. And we asked if their communities are welcoming of people who are, of immigrants who are not Christian. And again, they see their community as less welcoming of people who are not Christian. So I would like to talk about racism in these communities. And this is a measure of racism, a relatively recent measure, that isn't about whether you're racist, but whether you tolerate racism in others. These are a couple of the items. So someone can be a good person, even if they have some racist views, or other people have the right to their own views, even if they're racist. And this measure has been shown to predict not identifying racism when you see it. So you don't see racism even when an issue occurs, and you won't confront it. And so when we're thinking about bystanders, for example, these are the people who say racism isn't happening and don't do anything. And you can see here that in some of these communities, there is tolerance of racism in all of these communities, but in some communities more than others. And I think this is really important to acknowledge. Not that people are necessarily racist themselves, but they are tolerating it in others, and they're tolerating it around them and in their community. So I just want to summarize some of these findings, because I know I've gone quite quickly through a lot of data. So first of all, in terms of people's sources of information on immigration to Canada, the findings demonstrate the importance of news media, and especially television news, in potentially shaping attitudes in smaller communities. Some of these communities do not have a lot of people coming. There's not necessarily a lot of direct contact, but they don't know about immigration, and they know about it, they're saying, from news media. The attitudes are relatively favorable, but there is a sizable proportion of the residents who think there are too many immigrants coming to Canada. And in addition, people in these communities are particularly supportive of allowing economic immigrants and refugees, less supportive of family immigration. But there are some differences between the refugee groups, right? So attitudes towards Ukrainian refugees are more favorable than, and consistently across all the groups, or across all the communities, than toward Afghan refugees. Is this effect of the way the media is covering it? Is it effect of racism? Another question to be addressed. And in terms of attitudes in people's own communities, there's relatively high agreement that immigration to the local community should be encouraged. And most people see immigrants as having a relatively positive effect on their communities, things like filling labor shortages, multiculturalism. But there are some people who see immigrants as having a negative impact on their community, and they mention things like weakening Canadian values or the housing crisis, which is very convenient. And most people in these communities do see their communities as relatively welcoming of newcomers, but less welcoming of people who are racialized immigrants or who are not Christian. So a bit of a fault line in that positive welcome. They're pretty welcoming of immigrants, but it depends who the immigrants are. And I do want to mention this issue of tolerance of racism, which I think is really important, because it means that norms against racism may not be particularly strong in these communities. You know, when you see racism, you don't have to do anything about it, and nobody else is going to do anything about it either. So these are very preliminary initial findings from this data set. It's a huge data set, a very rich data set, and we're going to be continuing to analyze it, and so stay tuned for a lot more results. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Our last panelist today is Hector Vera. Hector va présenter les prévisions et les mesures pour atteindre les niveaux d'immigration francophone.
Merci. Hello, everybody. I'm going to speak in French, all the presentation, so if you have your headset, please take it. Bon. Ok, voilà. Bon, merci aux organisateurs de ce panel parce que je vous écoutais avant moi et puis c'est très bien que je suis à la fin. J'espère que pas tout le monde va partir, par contre. Bon, une des choses qu'on voit, c'est l'anglo-normativité, puis on l'a vu aussi dans la présentation des derniers, des panélistes ici. Tout est en anglais. Je remercie alors l'organisation de nous permettre de parler en français, puis de vous parler dans la deuxième langue officielle du Canada. Ici, bon, alors je vais vous parler d'immigration francophone, et quelle est notre situation, et puis quelles sont les solutions que nous, on amène comme organisation francophone. Alors, d'abord, je vais vous parler de moi. C'est quoi un francophone? Un francophone, je vais parler de moi parce que, bon, moi je suis d'origine chilienne. Ma langue maternelle est le français. Mais j'ai appris à lire et écrire en français avant que l'espagnol. Pourquoi? Bon, là, c'est moi, là. J'ai vécu en Belgique. J'étais réfugié, exilié, en fait, en Belgique. Mes parents étaient journalistes, et puis on a eu un 11 de septembre aussi en 73, et mon père, qui est là, j'ai le même nom que mon père, était le vice-recteur de l'Université du Nord du Chili, et c'était une personne considérée dangereuse. Alors il a dû se présenter, enfin il ne s'est pas présenté, ils l'ont attrapé en fait, mais il a été appelé comme une des personnes les plus dangereuses du nord du pays. Alors on est allé en Belgique, j'avais 2 ans quand je suis arrivé en Belgique, et puis là j'ai appris le français en fait, formellement, avant que l'espagnol. Bon, après en démocratie je suis revenu au Chili, je me suis marié, j'ai étudié là-bas, j'ai des enfants chiliens, mais en 2012 on est venu au Canada. Ma femme est venue faire un doctorat ici. Et on est resté. Et puis en mois d'août, on est devenu Canadien. Et oui, merci pour. Alors, bon, qui je suis? Je suis un néo-canadien d'origine chilienne, mais un franco-ontarien aussi. Et alors, je travaille à la FCFA. C'est quoi la FCFA? Bon, c'est un organisme qui existe depuis 1975 et on représente 2,8 millions de Canadiens et Canadiennes qui vivent à l'extérieur du Québec et qui parlent français, qui vivent en français tous les jours. Alors, depuis 2006 que cette organisation, mon organisation, travaille dans l'immigration. On coordonne un réseau en immigration francophone qu'on appelle RIF. Et en 2013 aussi, on organise une table nationale de concertation communautaire en immigration francophone. On fait plein d'autres choses, là, mais ça, ce sont les éléments principaux. Alors, pour avoir une petite idée de ce qu'on fait. Alors, je vais vous raconter maintenant une histoire, l'histoire de l'immigration francophone avec ce tableau. Et puis, c'est pour ça que j'étais content de participer à ce panel, parce qu'il y a des professeurs ici, des gens qui font la recherche. Et puis, tout commence en 1991 avec une étude que la FCFA a commandée sur les communautés francophones et acadiennes du Canada face au pluralisme. Et c'est là que les francophones commencent à faire des demandes pour l'immigration, justement. Et c'est là où on prend une conscience plus forte pour faire avancer ce sujet. Alors, c'est là qu'on prend conscience qu'on a besoin de l'immigration. L'immigration a un impact sur 80% de la croissance de la population au Canada dépend de l'immigration. Et bon, nous, on s'est rendu compte à un certain moment, mais 10 ans après, seulement 10 ans après, en 2001, on a un comité qui se crée avec Immigration Canada pour commencer à étudier l'affaire. Alors, c'est 10 ans que on a soulevé le sujet, mais 10 ans après, on commence à en parler. Et en 2003, on a un premier cadre stratégique et en 2006, le premier plan stratégique pour commencer à travailler. Alors, imaginez, plusieurs années après. Puis, en 2009, quand on n'a pas pu atteindre la cible qu'on s'était établie, on la déplace jusqu'en 2013. Alors, vous pouvez comprendre alors tous les efforts faits par notre organisation pour avoir une immigration francophone, mais au fur et à mesure que le temps passe, notre proportion, même si on a en quantité, les francophones immigrants arrivent constamment, mais il y a plus de personnes qui parlent anglais qui arrivent au Canada comme immigrants. Alors notre proportion tombe constamment. Alors, bien sûr, en 2013, on a eu on a rétabli la cible à 4%. Bon, la discussion continue là-dessus constamment. Et en 2021, il y a un document de réforme qui a été déposé par le gouvernement libéral pour adopter une politique en immigration francophone afin de maintenir le poids démographique de la population d'expression française. Alors, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Combien on a eu d'immigrants, en fait, en pourcentage à la population? Vous voyez ici, on a fait une étude là-dessus et on peut voir que la cible de 4% ou de 4,4% n'a jamais été atteinte. Il y a eu une redéfinition de c'est quoi un immigrant francophone plus inclusif en 2019, et même si on inclut plus de personnes qui parlent français, on continue de ne pas avoir de la quantité qu'on voulait avoir dans la politique d'immigration. Alors, il y a eu bien sûr d'autres études. Le commissaire a fait une étude aussi, et puis on a un déficit de 76 000 immigrants et immigrantes sur 14 ans. On a aussi découvert que même si on atteint la cible de 4,4%, ce n'est pas suffisant, parce qu'on va continuer de perdre un poids démographique, et alors, avec toutes les conséquences qu'il y a avec les politiques publiques. Moins de francophones, alors, moins de votants, moins d'intérêt. Alors, comment on peut expliquer cet échec? Il y a beaucoup d'explications, là. Moi, dans ma présentation originale, j'avais mis un petit robot dessiné, j'avais mis Chinook, mais c'était pour rigoler, en fait, parce que ce sont nous-mêmes qui programmons les systèmes, et il y a des besoins particuliers dans les francophones. Ce n'est pas la même chose qu'avec les anglophones, et on est des communautés plus petites, alors les besoins sont plus spécifiques et sont différents. Et ça, c'est quelque chose de très important à considérer ici. Alors, je remercie aussi l'étude que vous êtes en train de faire et que vous avez inclus maintenant les francophones, parce que dans la plupart des études, partout dans le pays où que les organismes, les agences de l'État font, la question sur la langue n'est pas posée. Alors, il y a très peu d'informations qu'on a par rapport aux francophones et surtout aux immigrants francophones. Alors, il y a très peu fait encore au Canada sur la promotion et le recrutement actif des sources francophones dans les pays de langue française. Et il y a des problèmes avec les visas, c'est pour ça que je parlais de Chinook. Il y a des problèmes avec des barrières à l'accueil, par exemple des étudiants étrangers. Il y a les provinces qui sélectionnent trop peu. Alors il y a plein d'explications pourquoi on n'est pas arrivé à ce 4,4%, mais qui n'est même pas suffisant. Alors, la question qu'on se pose, c'est combien alors qu'on doit avoir de francophones par an, et alors on a commandé une étude, et bon, je vous montre un petit tableau ici pour dire qu'on a fait notre travail, mais en fait, c'est plusieurs scénarios. On a plusieurs scénarios qui travaillent sur, qu'on a fait en utilisant Statistique Canada et puis le modèle d'Emocine de croissance démographique, en fait. Et voici les projections. Si on a une cible de 6%, on est encore en train de ralentir. Et puis, si vous voyez là, on avance dans les cibles pour avoir une croissance à 6,5% que c'était quand la population qui existait en 1971, on doit grandir à 35%, c'est-à-dire des 500 000 immigrants qui arrivent, 35% devraient être francophones. Imaginez. Alors, bien sûr, où on peut aller les chercher, là, en fait, c'est en Afrique. En Afrique. Et en Afrique subsaharienne, mais aussi en Afrique du Nord, bien sûr. Et alors, quelles sont nos demandes, en fait, là-dessus? Comment on peut arriver à aller chercher ces gens? Alors, d'abord, le chiffre. Hein. Alors, nous, on propose une croissance avec plusieurs étapes, bien sûr. Hein. Passer de 6 000 ou 8 000 immigrants francophones à 48 000 pour arriver à 80 000 par an d'ici 2036. Hein. Alors, comment le faire? On peut le faire avec un programme spécifique pour l'immigration, non seulement en établissement, mais dans plusieurs volets de nos des outils qu'a IRCC. Alors, on a en parrainage familial pour les réfugiés, la levée des barrières pour faciliter l'avenue des étudiants internationaux, francophones. Alors, on a une liste assez grande, là, ça continue ici. Il faut augmenter la capacité d'IRCC, il faut investir, il faut avoir la volonté politique. Alors, nous, on a développé à la FCFA plusieurs expériences, plusieurs projets pilotes. On travaille même avec des réfugiés afghans on essaye de prouver que nos communautés peuvent travailler dans les différents volets, justement pour commencer à développer des programmes plus spécifiques par rapport à nous. Alors, et finalement, pour terminer, il y a en ce moment même au comité des langues officielles du Parlement, de la Chambre des communes, on est en train de parler d'un nouveau projet de loi pour améliorer et réformer la loi sur les langues officielles. Et un des aspects qui est en discussion à l'intérieur de ce projet de loi, c'est d'obliger d'avoir une politique en immigration francophone avec des objectifs, des cibles et des indicateurs, parce qu'on n'en a pas. Quand il y a le plan qui est proposé par Immigration Canada et les objectifs en immigration, les francophones sont en bas, juste en bas du tableau, une petite ligne, mais on ne sait pas comment on va arriver à ces chiffres-là. Alors, on veut aussi que cet objectif d'immigration, l'objectif principal, c'est de maintenir et accroître le poids démographique des minorités francophones. Alors, il y a beaucoup à faire et j'espère que vous comprenez maintenant les enjeux. Ça fait des années que nos communautés demandent ceci. Ce n'est pas quelque chose qui est apparu il y a seulement quelques mois. Ça existe depuis, formellement et rationnellement depuis 1991. Grâce à des recherchistes qui ont fait des études. Et maintenant, nous, on est en train de se battre justement pour que le gouvernement ait une politique en immigration francophone spécifique et qu'on puisse alors avoir un Canada plus inclusif, bilingue, avec une francophonie qui vient de l'Afrique. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à tous les panélistes. Thank you to all panelists for the discussion. We still have some time for questions, so I'll remind everyone to use the Slido app. There's quite a few questions in there already, but feel free to submit more questions or vote for the questions that are there. I will start the questions. I'll start this question with you, David, and if you want to touch this from the policy side, and then open it up to any other panelists. The first question is, I imagine a world where Indigenous peoples have a lead role in integration. How do we enhance symbolic acts of solidarity into actually redistributing authority? So are you able to speak to that from the policy side? And then anyone else?
It's a big question. I mean, I'll start. I mean, I think the last call for proposals was the first where we put an intentional and an explicit kind of objective to sort of invite proposals and invite projects to start to really work concretely to that objective. So I know that, there's still definitely work to be done. I think the road is long. I think as Canadians, as anybody in this country, we know that road is a long one. One thing that I take, sort of the previous speaker sort of ended with a bit of a note of optimism. And I think, we've got, for the last 3 or 4 years, as many departments have done, we founded a youth advisory group. So bringing together 15 or 20 youth, often with lived experience of having been immigrants or newcomers themselves. And last year, the group chose and we encouraged them to look at truth and reconciliation and that alignment. And coming out of there, like, this is a group of young people who made recommendations to us as a department, the federal government, and we've had an opportunity to sort of bring them in to present these to us as senior management, but also as a bit of a call to action, accountability as well for what they've done. So for what they've prevented and what it will mean in terms of informing policy and program design. So long road there. We're giving, I think, some tools to sort of give ourselves the ability to bring the voice into some of that policy development and continue on. Thanks, Sir Roche.
Thanks, David. Anyone else want to add to that one? If not, next question, I'll start with you, Leah. In your update to welcoming community, why is there no information on disability? Many are coming to Canada with a disability and have no idea that they have rights or what their rights are.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So in the front end of the report, we will be talking about the importance of creating welcoming communities for multi-barriered groups. So this would include individuals with disabilities, people that are gender diverse, people from the LGBTQ2S+ community, racialized newcomers, and so on. So I didn't talk about that today, but there will absolutely be we will be talking about that in the report, and then have specific indicators that speak to this issue, particularly around things like affordable and suitable housing, inclusive public spaces, things like that. Just quickly, I saw a question about, are we going to share the results? Yes, that will become part of the report. I might even analyze that data on the plane this afternoon, if I can keep my energy up. So yes.
Thank you, Leah. So that's good. We're a little short on time, so if we can get to multiple questions, that's great. Next question, and this will be open for the panel. Hector, maybe I'll start with you on this one. Have you measured the impact of having settlement organizations with religious names?
OK. Oui. On n'a jamais, pardon, je vais répondre en français. On n'a jamais fait une étude là-dessus. Par contre, dans les sondages qu'on fait, la plupart du temps, les immigrants répondent dans la même tendance que la majorité de la population. Et il y a... alors, s'il y a un organisme religieux important ou une communauté religieuse importante, les immigrants commencent à s'adaptent rapidement et puis commencent à adopter le discours qu'il y a dans leur communauté. Ça, c'est quelque chose qu'on voit souvent dans nos études et dans nos sondages d'opinion qu'on fait. Et c'est intéressant. Mais on n'a jamais fait une étude là-dessus, avec un nom religieux. Non.
Merci. Vicky, I'd ask you the same question as well.
I also think it's an interesting question. I don't know of any research that's looked at this. I mean, anecdotally, we hear about this, that when organizations are linked with a particular religious affiliation, then people who aren't part of that group may not feel like they're supposed to go there, but I don't think there's data on this, so it's a good question and something we can look at.
Thanks. And I know that there has been some agencies, I know we had an agency in Calgary that took the religious part out of their name.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what the trend is there. Staying on the research side, and I'll stick with you, Vicky, and Leah on this one. How come there are so few studies done on immigrant perceptions of white or mainstream Canadians? How could that data influence service delivery and integration policy? And maybe I'll add to that, are there studies you're aware of that have investigated that?
Want me to start? Okay. There are studies, and of course you have to think about the context of the people who are conducting these studies. There are some studies looking at immigrants' perceptions of how they fit into the community, because it's always, a lot of the research is about sort of, I guess, the community's perception, the receiving community's perception of immigrants, and then immigrants' perception of how they want to fit into that community. I think that historically has been the norm. But where is that question now? Where's it gone? Oh, okay, the question's gone, but I think it is an interesting question to look at, the other perception. There it is. There are very few studies that are done on immigrants' perceptions of white Canadians. There are some studies that have looked at who people think are most Canadian, and what you find is that not only do white Canadians see white Canadians as most Canadian, but even racialized Canadians think of Canadians, the Canadian prototype, as being white. So, but I don't know of more data than that or more studies than that.
Next question is for you, Leah, and I know you touched on this a little bit. What is the timeline you're looking for on the work of the Welcoming Communities Toolkit, and maybe from both sides, maybe the characteristics side and the upcoming side?
Sure. So for the one I talked about today, the measuring welcoming communities, like we've made a lot of progress. So the characteristics and indicators are pretty much done, thanks in large part to the help of our awesome grad students. We just need to write the front end of that, but we were going to maybe let Vicky get through the rest of this week first, and then we'll turn to that. But hopefully as soon as possible, and then we'll turn to the workshops and then the promoting welcoming communities toolkit. So I don't have an exact timeline because we juggle so many things, but soon.
Thanks. A question for you, Vicky, and maybe you can speak to your own experience in collecting this data, but do you foresee challenges related to data availability for measuring welcoming communities at the small or rural levels, both for primary and secondary data?
So I think that's a really good question, because even collecting these data was a huge job, because these small communities are harder to get samples in. But one of the things we're going to be doing in the workshop is thinking about and talking about sources of information. So what Statistics Canada data are available, what data can we get from the research data centers. In the research data centers, you can get data at a very small level for small communities. And the nice thing about working with us is that we have grad students who can do that work. And what I mean is that, you can ask Statistics Canada to provide you with data. It costs money. Or you can pay our graduate students minimal money, their salaries, to actually do those analysis for you in the Research Data Center. And if there are workshops where there are a number of communities who are interested in doing this together, then it won't be expensive. And it's available, it's just hard to access.
Thanks. David, another question for you about IRCC data. Does IRCC track coverage on immigration to Canada in the ethnic media in order to take newcomer perspectives into account when creating programs and policies?
Yes, like there's tons, like, like every morning everybody who works gets the daily, I was going to call them clippings, I'm aging myself, but no, it's the press review. And there's also a separate kind of so-called ethnic press review and, getting into multilingual sources. So we've got a sense there from that of how things are playing in, in media. I think that's definitely one perspective. I think we want to push the reflection though, and then it is, that's a sign. But we in policy development, I mean, I think it's kind of what I was speaking to as well, is how do you push and get the perspective, not mediated necessarily. It's how do you inform policy design from the clients that you're expected to serve. So I think it's a litmus test. It's a good sense. It gives you a sense of what you should be asking, but then we should actually push ourselves in that process to say, hey, what are the perspectives of newcomers, of refugees, of newcomer youth, and how does that inform then how well we're doing?
Thank you.
I would like to... J'aimerais ajouter quelque chose là-dessus. C'est important d'étudier la situation. C'est important d'avoir les données, mais c'est aussi important de prendre des actions. Alors, par exemple, les bureaux pour les immigrants en Afrique subsaharienne, ben, il y en a un pour 35 pays. Là. Il y a de l'investissement qui n'est pas fait à IRCC, qui devrait être fait depuis longtemps. Moi, je pense qu'on doit continuer à étudier, on doit continuer à dialoguer, on doit continuer à travailler là-dessus. Mais tout le monde sait que le système est raciste et qu'il faut changer. Alors, moi, je pense que c'est le moment justement de faire les changements et de faire les investissements. Nous, on a l'habitude de dialoguer avec IRCC, et puis ça prend dizaines d'années avant de réagir, puis les conséquences sont néfastes. Alors, nous, on aimerait vraiment, comme francophone, que le gouvernement et puis les agences responsables d'IRCC prennent des décisions et puis fassent les investissements qu'ils doivent faire. Merci.
Merci. I see we're just a little over time. I want to get to two more questions. Next question is for you, Hector. When Canada is rejecting 80 to 90% of Francophone international student applications, how can this reality help grow the Francophone community?
Sorry. Ouais, c'est le même sujet que je viens de parler. Il n'y a pas d'explication rationnelle là-dessus, dans le sens où il n'y a pas les investissements suffisants, il y a un système qui fait de la discrimination, clairement, et il y a un manque de priorisation à l'intérieur d'IRCC là-dessus. Et pour nous, c'est clair qu'on doit faire ces changements-là. Les solutions sont claires, il faut le faire. Pour nous, et puis nous, on est là pour collaborer. Justement, nous, on espère qu'on puisse avoir ces immigrants francophones africains qui puissent arriver rapidement. On sait aussi que l'appareil prend du temps à bouger. C'est un gros appareil bureaucratique et puis mais on ne parle pas d'avoir 500 000 immigrants d'Afrique. Là. On parle de 40 000, 48 000 maintenant. C'est pas beaucoup là, quand on le voit dans tout l'appareil, mais c'est beaucoup pour nos communautés aussi, parce que il faut qu'on se prépare. C'est clair qu'on doit se préparer, c'est clair qu'on doit avancer là-dessus, mais c'est clair aussi qu'il faut faire les investissements nécessaires.
Merci. One last question, and I'll turn to you, Vicky. Where am I here? Newcomers' cultural integration is challenging in small communities in rural areas. What is your opinion to make smaller communities more welcoming? Big question.
That's a loaded question, but what I think is that it's first important to figure out what are the characteristics of that community by using the Welcoming Community Toolkit, and then working on those characteristics. You do have to know what are the gaps before you can address them. So I would say using the indicators will be a great way of starting that process.
Thank you very much. And thank you to my panelists, Leah Hamilton, David Katchbeck, Vicky Esses, Hector Vera, for the session today.